The air was electric with tension, the kind that crackles before a storm. Snowflakes clung to Olivia's dark lashes as she stared at the man standing before her. His breath came in short bursts, misting in the frigid aspen air, and his blue eyes, wide with urgency, held a question she wasn't sure she had the courage to answer. "Say something," Ethan pleaded, his voice raw. She swallowed hard. How had it come to this? Just days ago, she had been a mother, chaperoning a harmless ski trip with her son's college friends. Now, she was standing on a secluded mountainside, her pulse racing for a man she should never have fallen for. The door behind them burst open, and Olivia's breath hitched. Caleb stood there, his face a mixture of confusion and growing horror. What the hell is going on here? The moment of reckoning had arrived. The invitation had arrived in the most casual way possible. An email from Caleb, brief and to the point. A ski trip, Aspen, a week of relaxation. She had almost deleted it without a second thought. Olivia had spent years in motion, always occupied, always working. Her law firm demanded excellence, and she had given it, often at the expense of personal indulgences like vacations. Ski trips belonged to another life, one where she had been a wife, a young mother, a woman who made space for things like adventure and leisure. That woman felt distant now. She had barely acknowledged winter in recent years, too busy rushing between courtrooms and offices to notice the change of seasons. Snow was something that fell in the background of her life, visible only in glimpses through the towering windows of her high-rise. But Aspen, that was something different. It was a place tied to memories of laughter, of crisp mountain air, filling her lungs as she glided effortlessly down slopes, of fires crackling in grand lodges where she and Caleb, much younger then, would warm their frozen fingers over hot chocolate, back when life had been simpler. She hesitated before answering him. A trip with Caleb and his college friends, all of them young, energetic, full of a recklessness she no longer possessed, felt absurd. She imagined herself sitting alone by the fire while they skied at breakneck speeds down double black diamonds, or worse, tagging along like an outsider, the lone 42-year-old in a sea of 20-somethings, trying to find common ground. But something in Caleb's message lingered. You need this. Had she really become so predictable that even her son knew she wouldn't take a break? She stared at her laptop screen, debating. Outside, the city streets were blanketed in ice, the cold pressing against the glass of her window. Inside, her apartment was warm, but sterile, its silence familiar, yet suffocating. She had built this life, meticulously, brick by brick, ensuring there were no cracks, no room for vulnerability, no space for loneliness. But lately, she felt them creeping in anyway, the empty spaces growing wider, harder to ignore. And so, she did something unexpected. She sent Caleb a reply. I'm in. The house was even grander than she had imagined, nestled among snow-draped evergreens. The lodge stretched wide, all sleek glass and dark wood, with vaulted ceilings and panoramic views of the mountains, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a luxury travel magazine. She stepped inside and was immediately engulfed by the scent of pine and the low hum of conversation. Caleb's friends were already there, sprawled across leather couches, their laughter filling the space. She recognized a few of them, faces that had passed through her home over the years, voices she remembered calling out to Caleb in the background of phone calls. But there was one face she hadn't seen in a long time. Ethan. He stood near the fireplace, leaning casually against the stone hearth, his golden brown hair slightly tousled, his sharp blue eyes catching the firelight. He had always been effortlessly charming, even as a teenager, but there was something different about him now, something sharper, more defined. The last time she had seen him, he had been a boy. Now, he was undeniably a man. Olivia, he said, his voice warm, familiar. And just like that, something shifted. She had convinced herself that this would be a trip like any other, a vacation, a break from work. She hadn't expected Ethan, and she certainly hadn't expected the way her pulse quickened at the sight of him. The days unfolded in a rhythm of fresh snow and crisp mountain air, the kind of winter beauty that demanded to be noticed. Olivia had arrived in Aspen expecting to feel like an outsider, the token older guest in a house full of youth and energy. And at first that was exactly how it felt. The others rose early, eager to hit the slopes, their laughter echoing through the high ceilings of the lodge. She lingered behind, content to sip coffee by the window and watch the snow fall in lazy swirls outside. She had never been a reckless skier. She preferred slow, controlled movements, the feeling of gliding rather than racing. Caleb and his friends, however, seemed to treat skiing like a competitive sport, each trying to outdo the other, with daring jumps and impossible speeds. Ethan was no different. She had watched him that first morning as he adjusted his gloves, his movements effortless, his body lean and strong in his ski gear. He was at home here in the mountains, his confidence evident in the way he moved, the way he laughed without hesitation, the way he took up space without ever seeming to force it. She told herself she was merely observing, nothing more. But as the days passed, she became increasingly aware of Ethan's presence. It wasn't just that he was there. It was the way he noticed her. At first, she dismissed it as politeness. He lingered in conversation with her longer than the others did. When she struggled with her gloves, he was the one to help her fasten them. When the group teased her about skipping a few ski runs, he defended her with an easy smile. "She's just smarter than all of us," he had said, flashing her a grin. "Relaxing in the hot tub while we break our bones on the slopes. Sounds like the winning strategy to me." The others laughed, but Olivia felt a flicker of something deeper beneath his words. One afternoon, she finally decided to ski. She had resisted at first, but there was something exhilarating about the cold air against her face, the familiar pull of the slopes beneath her feet. She had chosen an easier trail, something scenic and calm, away from the chaos of the others. She didn't expect Ethan to join her, but as she reached the first turn, she heard the unmistakable swoosh of skis cutting through the snow behind her. "You're avoiding us," he teased as he pulled up beside her. She smirked. "I'm just taking my time. Not everyone is trying to qualify for the Winter Olympics." He chuckled. "Fair enough. Mind if I tag along?" She hesitated, but only for a moment. "If you can slow down enough to keep up with me." To her surprise, he did. They skied together for nearly an hour, moving at an easy pace, enjoying the stillness of the mountains away from the noise of the main slopes. He didn't push her to go faster, didn't treat it like a challenge. Instead, he matched her rhythm, gliding beside her as they weaved through snow-draped trees and open stretches of untouched powder. "This is nice," she admitted as they paused at a lookout point. The valley stretched wide before them, a perfect sheet of white beneath the clear sky. "It is," he agreed, his voice quieter now. She turned toward him, expecting him to be watching the view, but he wasn't. He was watching her. Something about the way he looked at her in that moment made her breath catch. It wasn't just admiration. It wasn't just friendly. It was something else. She should have looked away. She should have laughed it off, changed the subject, made a joke about how she was too old to be standing on a mountain like this with someone like him, but she didn't. For the first time in a long time, she let herself feel it, the undeniable awareness between them, the undercurrent of something unspoken, but real. It lasted only a few seconds. Then Ethan broke the silence. "We should probably head back before they send a search party." She nodded, but as they made their way down the slope, her heart was racing faster than it should have been, not from skiing, but from him. The house was quiet that night, except for the occasional crackling of the fireplace and the faint howl of the wind outside. Most of the group had gone into town, eager for a night of drinking and celebration. Olivia had declined the invitation, opting instead for the comfort of the lodge. The thought of standing in a crowded bar, trying to keep up with the energy of Caleb and his friends, felt exhausting. She curled up on the leather couch, a glass of red wine in hand, the warmth of the fire softening the chill in the air. It was peaceful until the front door swung open, bringing a burst of cold air and the sound of boots on the hardwood floor. Ethan. He stepped inside, brushing snow from his tousled hair, his cheeks pink from the cold. He looked different like this, relaxed, slightly windswept, and yet still carrying that quiet confidence that made it impossible not to notice him. "You're back early," she remarked, taking a sip of her wine. "So are you," he countered, his lips curving into a small smile. He set his gloves on the side table and walked over to the couch, settling into the seat across from her. She raised an eyebrow. "I never left." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Not a fan of wild nights out?" She smirked. I like my wild nights with a little less noise and a lot more sleep. Ethan chuckled, stretching out. You know, I always thought you were different from most of the moms I knew growing up. She tilted her head. Different how? He hesitated, watching her in that way that made her stomach tighten. You never just existed for Caleb. You always had your own thing, your career, your own life. You're more than just someone's mother. The words struck a nerve she hadn't realized was raw. For so many years, she had let her identity be wrapped around Caleb and her work, never stopping to consider what existed beyond that. She exhaled, her gaze dropping to the fire. I guess I never really thought about it that way. Ethan studied her for a long moment. You should. Something shifted between them in that moment. It was subtle, like a thread pulling tighter, an invisible line drawing them closer. The space between them felt smaller, more intimate, and she became acutely aware of every detail. The way the firelight reflected in his blue eyes, the way his fingers drummed absently against his knee, the way the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. She should have ended the conversation then, should have put distance between them, but she didn't. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let herself feel the weight of his presence, let herself acknowledge the way her heart had started beating just a little faster. Ethan was the one to break the silence. You don't let people take care of you, do you? She frowned slightly. What do you mean? He leaned back, his expression thoughtful. You're always the strong one, the one who has everything figured out, the one who takes care of everyone else. But when was the last time someone looked after you? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came, because the truth was she couldn't remember. For years, she had been the one holding everything together, at work, at home, in every aspect of her life. She was the one people relied on, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly. But here, in this quiet moment, Ethan had stripped away that image, exposing something far more vulnerable beneath it. I don't need looking after, she said finally, though the words felt hollow. Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he reached out, his fingers barely brushing against hers where they rested on the couch. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through her all the same. She should have pulled away. She didn't. Instead, she met his gaze, and for the first time, she let herself see what had been there all along, the admiration, the desire, the quiet longing that neither of them had dared to name. He moved first, closing the small space between them, his hand slipping gently over hers. "Olivia," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a question, an offering, a chance for her to stop this before it began. But she didn't stop him. She let him kiss her, and in that moment everything changed. The kiss should have never happened. It should have been a fleeting mistake, a moment of weakness quickly forgotten. But it wasn't. Instead, it became something neither of them could ignore. After that night by the fire, everything between them shifted. Olivia told herself it would end there, that it had to end there. But once a line like that is crossed, there's no going back to how things were before. The next morning, she avoided Ethan, staying upstairs longer than usual, pretending to be occupied with emails that didn't need answering. She told herself if she could just put space between them, whatever had ignited between them would fizzle out. But when she finally emerged, he was there. He was always there. At breakfast, their eyes met across the dining table, and for a split second, the world around them faded. It was as if they were the only two people in the room, tethered by an unspoken understanding, by the weight of something they weren't ready to name. Olivia forced herself to focus on anything but him. She listened to Caleb's friends joke about their antics from the night before, laughed when she was supposed to, nodded along at the right moments, but she felt Ethan watching her, and she felt herself wanting to look back. She had never been the kind of woman who entertained recklessness. She had built her life on discipline, on control. She had spent years making careful, responsible choices, always considering the consequences. So why was she throwing all of that away for stolen glances and a touch that lingered too long? But it wasn't just the attraction, though that was undeniable. It was the way Ethan saw her, the way he spoke to her, like she was someone beyond just Caleb's mother, beyond just a woman balancing a career and responsibilities. He spoke to her like she was still Olivia, the person she had forgotten she used to be, and that terrified her. The secrecy of it all made everything feel sharper, more electric. The way his fingers would brush against hers in passing, The way he would lean in, too close when he whispered something to her. The way he would catch her alone in quiet moments, his voice low, deliberate. One afternoon, when the others were out skiing, she found herself in the kitchen, making tea. She hadn't heard him come in, but she felt him before she saw him. She turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he stepped closer. "You're avoiding me," he said quietly. She exhaled, gripping the edge of the counter. "This can't happen, Ethan." It already did. His words hung between them, and she hated how easily they unraveled her. She shook her head. It was a mistake. "Is that what you really think?" She should have said yes. She should have ended it right then and there. But instead, she said nothing, because the truth was, she wasn't sure what she thought anymore. Ethan took another step, his presence overwhelming, consuming. "Tell me you don't feel this," he said, his voice almost pleading. "Tell me you don't think about it." She swallowed hard, because she did think about it. She thought about it every time she closed her eyes. But what scared her more than anything wasn't the desire. It was how easy it would be to give in. Her breathing was uneven as she looked up at him. "Caleb, I know," Ethan said, his expression tightening. "I know this is complicated. I know he's my best friend. But Olivia, this isn't nothing." She closed her eyes, shaking her head. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand," he said, "because I can't pretend like this isn't happening. I don't want to." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. She could hear the wind whistling outside, the distant laughter of voices returning from the slopes. They were running out of time. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "We can't do this, Ethan." His jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he might argue. But instead, he nodded, stepping back, the space between them suddenly feeling colder than it should have. "If that's what you want," he said softly. But even as he walked away, she knew it wasn't what she wanted. Not really. Secrets have a way of unraveling, no matter how carefully they're kept. Olivia had spent days convincing herself that nothing had really happened between her and Ethan, that the kiss had been a fleeting lapse in judgment, a moment stolen by the glow of the fire and the weight of unspoken loneliness. She told herself that as long as she kept her distance, as long as they didn't cross that line again, it would fade into nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was in the way her pulse quickened when he entered a room, in the way his gaze would linger on her for a fraction too long, in the way she would catch herself searching for him in a crowd, only to find he had already been looking at her. And the worst part? She didn't want it to stop. The guilt sat heavy on her chest, but it wasn't enough to keep her away. If anything, the secrecy only heightened the pull between them. Each stolen moment felt sharper, electric, like they were teetering on the edge of something dangerous and irreversible. That was how it happened. One careless moment, one step too far. It was their last night in Aspen, and the others had gathered in the great room, drinking and playing music, their laughter echoing through the high ceilings of the lodge. Olivia had excused herself, retreating to the back deck for a breath of cold, crisp air. She needed space, distance, a moment alone to clear her thoughts. But she wasn't alone for long. Ethan stepped outside, closing the door softly behind him. For a second, neither of them spoke. Snowflakes drifted lazily in the air, settling on his hair, melting on the warmth of her skin. "You shouldn't be out here," she murmured, though she didn't move away. "You knew I'd come," he said simply, and she had. He stepped closer, the heat of his body a stark contrast against the winter air. She felt his breath against her cheek, the hesitation in his movements, like he was waiting for her to stop him. But she didn't. She let herself lean in, just enough to feel the space between them vanish, just enough to make it real. And that was the moment Caleb stepped outside. The door swung open with a sharp gust of wind, and Olivia pulled back as if burned. But it was too late. Caleb's face twisted in confusion, then something worse. Realization. "What the hell is this?" His voice was sharp, disbelieving. Olivia's stomach dropped. Ethan took a step forward. But Caleb's expression darkened, his hands balling into fists. "Don't," he snapped, his voice thick with betrayal. He turned to Olivia, his eyes burning with something she had never seen before. "Mom, what is going on?" She opened her mouth, but no words came, because there was no excuse, no way to explain this in a way that wouldn't shatter everything. Caleb let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This is a joke, right?" Please tell me this is some messed up misunderstanding. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. It's not what you think. Caleb's gaze snapped to him. Oh, it's exactly what I think. His voice wavered between fury and devastation. My best friend, my mother. The weight of his words hung heavy in the freezing air, each syllable cutting through Olivia like a blade. Caleb, she said finally, her voice almost pleading. I never meant. You never meant what? His voice cracked, and for the first time, she saw the hurt beneath the anger. To get caught? No, Just how long has this been going on? Silence. And that silence was his answer. Caleb let out a bitter laugh, stepping back as if he couldn't stand to be near them. I trusted you, he said to Ethan, shaking his head in disbelief. I trusted you. Ethan swallowed hard. I never wanted to hurt you, Caleb. But you did, Caleb said, his voice cold now. Both of you did. He turned, storming back inside without another word. The door slammed shut, and the silence that followed was deafening. Olivia felt her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. It was over. The secret was out, and nothing would ever be the same again. The house was suffocatingly quiet. After Caleb had stormed back inside, Olivia had expected shouting, accusations, maybe even the crash of something breaking. Instead, the silence stretched, thick with tension, heavy with betrayal. She hesitated at the door, her breath misting in the cold night air. She didn't want to go inside. She didn't want to see the hurt in Caleb's eyes again, but hiding outside wouldn't change what had happened. With a deep breath, she stepped back into the warmth of the lodge, her pulse hammering in her ears. She found Caleb in the living room, standing near the fireplace, his back to her. The others had noticed something was wrong. Conversations had quieted, heads had turned, but no one spoke. They were waiting, sensing the storm on the horizon. Ethan followed her in, shutting the door behind him. The sound made Caleb turn. His jaw was clenched so tight she thought it might shatter. You don't have to explain, Caleb said, his voice eerily calm. I get it. I really do. Caleb, Olivia started, but he held up a hand, cutting her off. No, seriously. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. It all makes sense now. The weird tension, the way you two kept looking at each other, the sneaking off. His expression hardened. Was I just too blind to see it? Olivia's throat tightened. It wasn't like that. Caleb scoffed. Really? Because from where I was standing, it sure as hell looked like that. He turned to Ethan, his hands curling into fists. And you, my best friend. I trusted you with everything. You were like a brother to me. Ethan took a slow breath. I didn't plan this, Caleb. Caleb's eyes darkened. But you sure as hell didn't stop it, did you? Olivia stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Caleb, I know this is hard, but what? He turned to her now, raw betrayal in his expression. You're my mother. Do you know how insane this is? Do you have any idea how messed up this looks? Olivia flinched, but she refused to back down. I never meant to hurt you. Well, congratulations, he shot back. You did. The others in the room were motionless now, exchanging glances, no doubt, trying to piece together what they had just walked into. Let's talk about this privately, Ethan said, his voice controlled. Caleb shook his head. No, there's nothing to talk about. His voice was quieter now, but that only made it worse. I can't even look at you right now. Caleb, I trusted you, he said, shaking his head, and you ruined that. The weight of his words pressed against Olivia's chest. She had expected anger. She had even expected disgust, but the disappointment, that was unbearable. Caleb turned on his heel, grabbing his coat. Where are you going? She asked. Away from here. And then he was gone. The night stretched on in a haze of regret. Olivia sat in the darkened living room long after Caleb had left, staring at the dying embers of the fire. Ethan had tried to talk to her, but she had barely responded. Eventually, he had gone upstairs, giving her space. She knew she should call Caleb, but what would she even say? Would he even listen? She had never felt this lost before. For years, she had been the one in control, the one with answers, the one people relied on. But now, she had no script, no plan, no way to fix what had been broken. And the worst part? She wasn't sure she wanted to fix it, because despite everything, despite the pain in Caleb's eyes, despite the weight of the fallout, she didn't regret what had happened with Ethan, and that scared her more than anything. The morning after Caleb left, Olivia woke to an unbearable silence. The house, once filled with the hum of laughter and movement, felt hollow. Even the snow outside had settled in a thick, soundless blanket, as if the entire world had paused, waiting for her to decide what came next. She hadn't slept. How could she? Her mind had played the night's events on an endless loop. The look in Caleb's eyes when he realized the truth, the sharp edge of betrayal in his voice, the way he had walked away without looking back. She reached for her phone. No messages, no missed calls, nothing. Caleb had vanished into the cold, leaving only his anger behind. The weight of it all pressed down on her as she sat up in bed, rubbing her hands over her face. What had she done? She had spent her life making careful, responsible choices, choices that protected Caleb, choices that ensured stability. And yet, in the span of a few days, she had unraveled it all. A soft knock at the door made her freeze. She didn't have to ask who it was. "Come in," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Ethan stepped inside, his expression cautious. He looked as exhausted as she felt. Dark circles beneath his eyes, tension in the set of his jaw. He closed the door behind him, hesitating, as if unsure whether she wanted him there. "How are you?" he asked finally. She exhaled a humorless laugh. "You really want to ask me that?" He sat on the edge of the bed, resting his elbows on his knees. "I haven't heard from him either." That hurt more than it should have. Caleb wasn't just shutting her out. He was shutting Ethan out too. "He hates me," she murmured, staring at her hands. Ethan shook his head. "He's angry. He's hurt. But he doesn't hate you." She lifted her gaze to his, searching for something. Reassurance, maybe, or an answer to the question she was too afraid to ask. "What if he never forgives me?" Ethan's jaw tensed. "Then he's a fool." She sighed, shaking her head. "He's not a fool. He's my son." A silence stretched between them. Then, softly, Ethan said, "Do you regret it?" The question lingered in the air like smoke. Did she? Regret would have been easier. If she could just say yes, if she could convince herself that this had been nothing more than a mistake, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much. Maybe she could go back to the life she had before. But she didn't regret it. Not the way Ethan looked at her. Not the way he made her feel. Like she was something more than just someone's mother, someone's employee, someone fulfilling a role. He had reminded her of something she had long forgotten. She was still alive, and she wasn't ready to let that go. She met his gaze. "No," she admitted, "I don't." Ethan let out a breath, nodding slowly. She reached for his hand, curling her fingers around his. "But that doesn't mean this isn't impossible." His grip tightened around hers. "Nothing about this is impossible, Olivia." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that the world wouldn't rip them apart, that Caleb wouldn't turn his back on her forever, that love, real, unexpected, complicated love, was worth the risk. But was it? Before she could answer, her phone vibrated against the nightstand. She grabbed it, heart pounding, as she saw Caleb's name on the screen. A single message. "We need to talk." Her breath caught. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. But it was something. She turned to Ethan, her grip on the phone tightening. "It's Caleb." Ethan nodded, then talked to him. She swallowed hard, knowing this conversation could change everything, knowing there were no guarantees. But for the first time since arriving in Aspen, she wasn't afraid of what came next.